Thank you. So I wanted to start today with a question. And the question is a serious one, but I don't want you to raise your hand or anything. I don't want to out anyone or anything like that. I just want you to think of your answers, and we'll talk about it after a little bit. So what I found is that I travel the world. We've got offices on 3 continents. I talk to people all over the place. And if we're honest, a lot of people will actually admit that they use. And they'll say that they use at home. Some people, the most honest of us, will actually admit that they use in the car sometimes. They feel guilty about it, but it happens. And a lot of people will actually admit that they use at the office, but it's really not very satisfying. Now, of course, we're all users, software users. And if you think about it in terms of the Industrial Revolution, if we went back 100 years, very few of us would be steam engine users, the thing that powered the Industrial Revolution, but we're all software users. And what I want to talk about is the perspective, because we're all software users, and these systems drive our entire global economy now. They drive what we do in our personal lives, our Facebook accounts, our tweets, everything. I want to talk about it because I think that we don't do a very good job designing the software in the first place. And in order to do this, I want to tell you a few stories. And the first story I have for you is a story about World War II. And in World War II, when the Americans joined the war, they started daylight bombing Germany. And what they found was that about 50% of the planes that they sent over to bomb Germany were not coming back. And this was a huge issue. So they put their brightest minds together and they started thinking about it. And they thought, you know what, we have to armor these planes. We have to better armor the planes. But we can't armor the whole plane, because if we armor the whole plane, it's a tank, and tanks don't fly. We all know that. So we have to be very judicious. So they measured all of the B-17 bombers coming back for where they had flak hits, the bullet holes. And they measured all of them, and they calculated all the size of the hole, the relative severity of it, all of that stuff. And they fed that information back to a bunch of PhD math scientists in New York City. And they started analyzing it, trying to figure out where to armor the planes. And then one of the guys put his hand up and he said, wait a second, we have a problem here. And the problem is that we're not looking at the planes that crashed over Germany, we're looking at the planes that safely flew home. And the best data is actually missing. Every bullet hole that we've recorded is actually a bullet hole that the plane can take and sustain and fly home. So what they had to do is they had to invert it and look at where the planes weren't hit. And not surprisingly, they weren't hit in the cockpits where the pilots were, because if you hit them there, they go down. They weren't hit in the bomb bays where the bombs, the explosive stuff was, and they weren't hit in the gas tanks. Not very shocking. So the piece of the moral of that story is that the best data is often missing. So now we're going to do a little bit of a magic trick. It seems like Bill is a place for magic tricks. So I'm going to do a little magic trick. Now, of course, I'm very bad with sleight of hand. As a matter of fact, I'm not even a magician. But I'm going to do this in PowerPoint for you. So what I want you to do is I want you to pick a card. So pick a card, any card. Ready? Memorize your card. Alakazam, your card is gone. Right? Your card is gone? No? Okay, so here's the answer. Your card wasn't there. This was the first set of cards I showed you. I'm a really bad magician. I'm showing my trick, the secrets. This is the second set. The second set is entirely different from the first. Now, why did the magic trick work? Well, what happened, and by the way, if you did choose the Jack of Hearts, I just blew your mind. What happened is your eyes, your mind focused on that one card. And you focused on that card to the exclusion of the other cards. And so the other cards just became noise to you. And therefore I was able to substitute them all and have you not notice. Face cards for face cards, you were fine. Okay? So we tend to focus on things to the exclusion of others. Now, the last story I'm going to tell you is a far grosser one, and it's about bloodletting. So, bloodletting was the height of medical science. It started, the first recorded instances or culture that took part in bloodletting was actually the ancient Egyptians, about 1000 BC. First recorded incidences that we know of. And the most amazing blow your mind fact is that we stopped as a culture, as humans, bloodletting en masse, believe it or not, in the mid-1800s. That's absolutely shocking. Now, the thing with bloodletting was that it was refined to a very, very high science. So it got to the point where literally they would actually know, oh, you've got a problem with your liver, drain this much blood from your left pinky and it will cure you. And they had it down to literally the part of the body that you had to drain, the amount of blood. It was very, very scientific. You went to med school and you studied this, and it was garbage. But here's what happened. What happened was that you were really sick, and they would call in the physician, and the physician would take your blood, remove it from you. And one of two things happened. This is A/B testing, or A/B negative, if you don't mind a blood joke. What happened was you either survived, and then you're at the dinner party telling all of your friends about how sick you were 2 weeks ago and how the physician came and took your blood and you lived and you miraculously healed from the blood loss and you made a case for bloodletting. The alternative is that you died. And if you died, then not even bloodletting could save you. And this is a huge problem. So if we take a look at these three stories in context, we put them together, what you're going to find is that often the answers are in the missing data. The next problem is that if you focus too much, you will miss data. And if you believe too strongly, you'll ignore data. And that's called theory blindness, and well documented in science. So I'm here to talk about software systems and the things in our pockets and how they work and everything like that. So I want to talk about it in terms of consumer versus enterprise software, because as a company we're more interested in software that is used in organizations. But here's a bit of a story. And amazing facts, this actually comes from AC Nielsen in July of 2014, so the numbers are probably higher now. But of mobile apps that are available, there was about 1.6 million available in the market in July of 2014. And what AC Nielsen discovered was that 70% of all app use was represented by 200 apps. And not only that, but 3/4 of all the apps that are downloaded are only used once after they're downloaded and then never used again. So I call this kind of software Darwinism, where we have this survival of the fittest apps. But when you look at it and you start looking at it in kind of context of missing data and bloodletting and overfocus, people will say, well, the successful apps had the best user interface. They had the best user experience. They had the best this or that. But actually, you can't believe that out of 1.6 million, only 200 of them were the best. There must have been a lot of good ones. So maybe we're not quite focused on the right thing. Now, if we talk about it in the enterprise space, and I assume that most of you are not fortunate enough not to work for a living, you work for some company and there's software that you need to use in order to get your job done. Well, there is no Darwinism there. There's no survival of the fittest. Somebody picked one software package or designed one software system, and that's what you have to use. There's no choice, there's no survival, there's no evolution, and yet they're using the exact same concepts, usability, user experience, all of these things to drive this. And fundamentally, they're wrong. And if I was going to tell this in an anecdotal story, I would tell you about a vice president at CIBC, which is one of Canada's largest banks, and before they even became a client of ours, I was out for lunch with him, and this is actually why they became a client of ours. I said to him, I postulated that when you guys stand up a new software system, you meet the requirements 100%. And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. We're amazing at project management. We're really good at requirements gathering. We do all this stuff really well. We understand user behavior, blah, 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 blah. And I said, yeah, I betcha. But I bet you that you missed the objectives by 50%, the organizational objectives, what the users want. And he goes, oh no, 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 we don't do that. Now, we missed them by 70%. And one of the reasons that you're all laughing and clapping is that it's true and we all know it's true. Our software is crap, 80% right there. So the question is why? And the answer really comes down to a bunch of pieces. But one of them is the concept of systematic bias. So here I am, I'm a Canadian, and I measure everything in centimeters. But imagine if I gave everybody here a ruler, and I only have centimeter rulers because I'm a Canadian, but I change it and I put inches wherever it says centimeters. Now you guys all go measure stuff, and you'll be everybody's measurements are going to match, but they're not going to be in inches. We're all going to be wrong. And if you took them to the lumber store, you're screwed, right? You're never going to order the right stuff. So the problem with this is that we measure things, and especially when we're talking about systems, business systems, software systems, everything that we do is now translated into some sort of a system. Even things that we do around our homes. We measure them with our intuition. And the problem is that we really never think about it, but what if our intuition is wrong? And what I'm going to suggest is that our intuition is very wrong. And I'm going to prove it to you. So the way I'm going to prove it to you is I'm going to talk about two types of intuition. Expert intuition, which you've heard of, and typical intuition, which is a name I made up because there's no name for intuition that's not expert intuition, believe it or not. So the analogy for this is an anesthesiologist versus a radiologist. So an anesthesiologist is sitting at the patient's head during an operation. And they have a monitor beside them, and they're getting the pulse ox, and they're getting the blood pressure and the heart rate, and they're checking all sorts of things, and they have all these different drugs that they can administer to adjust it, and the oxygen level, and all sorts of stuff. And they're making tiny adjustments, and they're watching the patient react. And they make these tiny adjustments again and again and again, and the patient reacts, and this creates a causality loop. And we call this a Pavlovian causality loop. So there's cause and effect, stimulus, response, and the person develops expert intuition. And so this anesthesiologist actually can tell you that the patient's going to crash before the patient crashes because of this expert intuition. Now let's talk about typical intuition and the radiologist. So a radiologist has been a radiologist for 20 years, and they say, I'm an expert at detecting cancer on MRIs. I see the shadow, I circle it, that's cancer. Well, let's look at that in reality. So they see it, they circle it, it's cancer, it gets passed to the cancer doctor passes it on to the surgeon does a biopsy, goes to the lab, comes back, not cancer. The surgeon tells the cancer doctor tells you, you don't have cancer, woohoo, we're really happy, and nobody tells the radiologist, right? So here's the problem. The radiologist is not an expert at detecting cancer on MRIs. They're an expert at detecting shadows that might be cancer. Huge difference, huge difference. And that's our typical intuition. So our typical intuition is very flawed. Very, very flawed. So how? Prove it. So here I'm going to prove it to you, and I'm going to prove it to you a few different ways. I want you to do this very quickly. I know you know I'm going to try to trick you, but let's go. A bat and a ball costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Just yell it out quickly. How much is the ball? 10 cents. Okay, so the right answer is 5 cents. If it's 10 cents, then it's $1.20 altogether. But your gut wanted 10 cents. If you hadn't seen this before, you go for 10 cents. It's the quick answer. We're designed for that. So let's talk about Mary. So her mom has 4 children. The children's names are April, May, June. What's the last kid's name? Well, here's the problem. You want to say July, but I said let's talk about Mary, right? Her name is Mary. I gotcha. So our brains naturally jump at patterns. We assume patterns and then we extend patterns. We're designed for pattern recognition. It's a huge problem that we face. So if we think about this, we design the systems that we're talking about, all these computer systems, with our flawed intuition. So if we want to look at that, generally speaking, the very first step that we take in designing any kind of system is requirements gathering. So what do? Step one, we get all the people concerned with it in a room. Step two, we fail. How do I know we fail? Well, you guys already acknowledged that there's lots of crappy software out there in the world. And if we're doing it the same way, that's the definition of insanity, right? So why? Why do we fail? Well, I can summarize it in one word, heuristics. So then the question is, what's a heuristic? So a heuristic is a simple, efficient rule that your brain uses as a shortcut for decision making, okay? So let's talk about this. And these mental shortcuts lead to biases. And biases, so there's a finite number of heuristics and an enormous number of biases that come out of those heuristics. But if we want to talk about it in terms of something that you would easily understand, let's talk about Star Wars. You're George Lucas, you're making Star Wars 17, it's going to be a hit, $1 billion worldwide, and you've got to create a creature that lives on another planet that's really scary. So what do? You give it big, long teeth, huge teeth. Well, why? Because we are programmed evolutionarily, to recognize big teeth as something scary and run away from, and it could eat you. It's a sign of carnivore. And I can prove it because if your ancestors didn't think that, you're probably one of the empty seats here, right? So this works because of a simple law. It's actually one of the easiest laws in psychology and neuroscience to ever remember. It's called the law of least effort. What it means is we avoid effort. That's it. And how do we avoid effort? We use heuristics. We see big teeth, we're afraid of it, we turn around and run. Your brain processes that automatically. So what I want to do is I want to give you a couple of examples of heuristics. I could stay here all day and tomorrow going through them, but I'm going to give you two. So the first one is called availability. And I know you're expecting me to trick you somehow, but let's do this in the most naive way. And we'll talk about movie stars since we're in Hollywood. And if I said movie stars divorce often, the availability heuristic is your ability to quickly remember examples of. So if I say movie stars divorce often, and I say more often than lawyers or dentists, you'll probably nod your head. And the reason is that you believe because you can recall. You can't check out at the grocery store or any store without seeing these rags. Brad and Angelina are divorcing again for the 23rd time or whatever. And that's availability. So it causes you to be biased towards things you can recall more quickly. Now, the funny thing about that is, let's get back to big teeth. We're biased against things with big teeth. We're afraid of sharks. And actually, what's interesting is that sharks have their own theme song, right? We all know it. Na-na, 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 right? But here's the thing. You lost focus there. Because beside the shark is this little guy who doesn't have teeth at all, called a mosquito. And the World Health Organization says that about 10 people a year are killed by sharks. And about 750,000 people a year are killed by mosquitoes. So think about it, and think about the times that you haven't gone swimming, or you've worried, or you talk to surfers who say, I love to see dolphins because they run off the sharks and all that stuff, and nobody's worried about sitting in the backyard having a barbecue and getting bitten by a mosquito. So it's misdirected our focus. So if we talk about this in terms of business, managers deal with exceptions all day long. That's what management does, right? Deal with exceptions. And if I ask you a question like, what did you have for lunch last Tuesday? You probably don't remember. Not an exceptional lunch. If I asked you your lunch on your birthday, or where you were on 9/11, or which hospital your child was born in, or anything like that, you will remember that, because that's an exceptional exception. And the problem is that managers recall exceptional exceptions. And those exceptional exceptions are what's used to drive the requirements in the first place. So another heuristic that relates to this is anchoring and adjustment. And the concept of this is really kind of simple. You drop the anchor, and then all of the ideas end up falling or adjusting to be around that anchor. If you've ever negotiated for a used car, you know it. If the car salesman says the price, you know you're going to pay somewhere close to that. If you say the price, maybe you got a chance. So if we talked about this in terms of politics, because it seems like America's talking about politics these days, we'll talk about a case that was done, a study was done in 2002, long before the Donald. What they did is they took a bunch of people who identified themselves as Republicans, and they surveyed them to put them on a scale of moderate to extreme. Then they stuck them in a room and they had them talk politics with each other for about an hour. After the hour, they brought them back up and they surveyed them again. And guess what happened? Everybody moved right. Now, if you think that's awesome, I'm not a Republican. The same thing happened with Democrats. Sorry. So there's tons and tons and tons of heuristics and tons more biases that come out of those heuristics, and we have to be thinking about them. So when I think about this stuff, I think about a term that we use in our organization that we call intellectual inertia. And what that really is if you're thinking in a certain direction, you tend to continue thinking in that direction until a very severe force is placed upon you, like abject failure. But if not, your solution, to quote a famous quote, if your only tool is a hammer, all your problems tend to look like nails. This is intellectual inertia. So if you look at that, what you know limits what you can imagine. This is Cynthia Barton-Rabe, who ran innovation for Intel. But if what you know is wrong, then what you're imagining is limited in a very wrong way. And that's a huge issue in itself. So what we suggest is that what you want to do is you want to change your perception in general. I want you to leave the concepts of usability and user experience and all of that stuff, and instead move more towards psychology and the approach of using psychology and understanding the problems that we have as human animals and our biases before we start designing the systems. So if I was going to channel Peter Drucker, who is the father of modern management thinking, he said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I assume a lot of you have heard that. The thing is, when we talk about it and we break it down, culture is actually psychology. And everything that happens in an organization's culture is described with psychology. The big problem is that most organization strategy is described using software. It's implied using software, it's implemented using software. And that's really the failing. So what I'm hoping that you guys can take away from this is a broader thinking about how we design systems. And it doesn't really matter if it's a system for your own personal use, if it's a system for your company, if it's even a process on how to run an event like Bill. You always bring your biases to the table. And what you really need to be able to do is check your biases and understand that they're there and question them. And if you can do that, you will be successful. Thank you.
Stuart Sherman, thank you very much.